Hello and welcome to Control F, the NSI Cyber and Tech Center's podcast that features season-long groupings of issues at the intersection of technology and national security. Our first season of Control F is an 8-episode series focused on game-changing technologies. These episodes are released every other week over the course of 4 months and take a deep dive into the key emerging technologies that are reshaping our world and the ever-evolving tech policy landscape alongside them. During each episode this season of Control F, we are featuring a leading technical expert in a game-changing area of technology, as well as a key investor funding the practical application of those technologies. So today, we're going to be talking about differential privacy. Differential privacy is transforming data analysis by enabling valuable insights while also protecting individual privacy, with significant implications for industries like healthcare, finance, demographic analysis, and national security, as well as key implications for privacy regulation and ethics, particularly in the current era of big data and machine learning. I'm joined by two fantastic experts in the field to help unpack how differential privacy is changing the way we approach data and protect individual privacy. Dr. Damien Desfontaines is a senior staff scientist at Tumult Labs, a startup focused on differential privacy, works on secure data anonymization. Previously, Dr. Desfontaines led Google's anonymization consulting team, integrating differential privacy into key projects, including public health initiatives. Dr. Desfontaines also serves on the European Data Protection Board's support pool of experts, advising on anonymization techniques and privacy-enhancing technologies. He holds a PhD from ETH Zurich in scalable anonymization and re-identification risk analysis, and a master's degree in mathematical logic and theoretical computer science from the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Andrew McClure is a managing director of Forgepoint Capital, where he invests in early and growth stage companies developing technology to protect the digital world. He serves on the board of directors for Constellar Intelligence, Converge Insurance, CyberCube Analytics, Surefire Cyber, and Wirewheel, and has previously been on the boards for Previty, Behaviosec, and Incisive, all acquired by other companies. Andrew has also led several spin-out investments for Forgepoint and has incubated 2 companies within the firm. Prior to Forgepoint, Andrew served as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he led cross-functional teams in Afghanistan, the Middle East, East Africa, and Australia, focused on signals intelligence and cyber operations. He currently remains active in the reserves. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and holds advanced degrees from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, MIT's Sloan School of Management, and the Australian National University. He's also a visiting fellow here at NSI and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. When he's not in the office, he loves playing with his 5 children. All right, team, so let's get started. Dr. Desfontaines, let's get started with you. Let's level set on this technology because, for the uninitiated like me, a lot of our listeners may not know what differential privacy is at all. So let's start right at the top. What is it? What is differential privacy? And why does anybody care about differential privacy in particular?
It's like you said, the single sentence that you said about it, a couple of minutes ago is essentially accurate. Differential privacy is a framework that allows you to extract and share or publish or monetize critical insights from sensitive data without leaking the information about specific people. So it's this way to balance the accuracy and the value of the data that you're working with without or while controlling and limiting formally the amount of privacy leakage.
And so why does it matter? Like, why does it matter that we should be able to use data sets while also protecting individual privacy? I mean, I get that people may not want their information put out there, but is it really possible in a large data set of information to derive what my information that's in there if we're just using the data set? And how could you possibly do that?
Yeah, differential privacy was born in academia out of the repeated failures of anonymization techniques that came before. Essentially, we have known for 3 decades that releasing data in a de-identified way using ad hoc anonymization methods is broken and can lead to sort of critical privacy failures where even though you're only publishing either de-identified data where you remove identifiers or maybe some kind of generalized data where you've tried to add a little bit of jitter here and there, or maybe change ages to age ranges and something like this.
Right.
Or even if all you're doing is publishing statistics, there are attacks that will actually, from this seemingly innocuous data, will actually get back information about specific people. Differential privacy is the first, and to this date, only approach that gives you provable formal guarantees that this can't happen. And so they give you this very nice knob that you can tune between privacy and accuracy, but on the privacy front, you get actual guarantees that you can rely upon in a way that you could not rely on ad hoc methods.
Interesting. And I want to come. Go ahead, please. No, please go ahead.
And as
Damien.
to like in which context is this useful, it's really there's a vast array of situations throughout both government and industry where you want to publish something, insights, maybe synthetic data or machine learning models, out of sensitive data without revealing specific information. So you can think of a hospital trying to share data with researchers. You can think of a government agency like the U.S. Census Bureau trying to publish a lot of statistics about the country to let researchers work on it to enable a whole sort of use cases. You can think of a financial institution trying to monetize the data of the people, the credit card data that they have, without, of course, leaking anything specific to individual people, which would be a large breach of confidentiality.
Interesting. So, I actually didn't realize this, but as I was looking into this topic, it turns out, and tell me if this is right, Damien, if you have sort of say a census tract, right, a large set of data, right, apparently with a few pieces of information about an individual, you can sort of run an attack against the overall statistical results and return more information on an individual. Is that roughly right? Is that one of the kind of things that we're talking about? Because that seems hard to believe from the outside. And why does that work? And then, Andrew, I do want to come to you, but I'm interested in Damien's view on this.
Yeah, this is a great question, and this is exactly the something that the U.S. Census Bureau realized a few years ago when they tried to run these sort of academic reconstruction attacks, they're called, on the data they published in 2010 for the decennial census back then. Essentially, you can see that when you're releasing a lot of statistics about the data sets, what you're doing is releasing the result of a bunch of equations where the unknown variables in the equation is just every person's individual data. And the sort of high-level intuition is that if you're releasing a lot of statistics, at some point you get a big system of equations that you can just solve using a linear solver, which is something that mathematicians have known how to do for decades. And so then from these statistics, if you have a lot of statistics that you just published, you can actually go back to individual pieces of information, and then you can link this with, say, auxiliary data sets that you obtained from commercial data and get additional information, like let's say ethnicity data that only the census knows, but maybe the commercial data set does not know, or household information, like how many children people have, or whether they're in the same-sex household, or such information could be obviously like super sensitive, and the U.S. Census Bureau does not want this information revealed via statistics.
Interesting. So, Andrew, it sounds like, this concept of differential privacy, and we'll get more into how it works and how successful it is at protecting these issues and the trade-off, right? Could have some significant benefits, but let's step back and before we get into the details of that and talk about why this balance between access to large amounts of data on one side and the privacy of individuals might matter in the context of investments, right? Particularly in emerging technology, right? When you invest at Forgepoint, the venture capital firm out in the Valley, in technologies that are at the cutting edge of our cybersecurity ecosystem, do you guys look at these privacy enhancing technologies? Do you look at investing in companies that provide these kind of capabilities, or do you look for the use of those technologies in the companies you invest in? And if you do, in either case, why is that important to a firm like Forgepoint?
Well, thanks, Jamil. Of course, look, as investors, we seek to invest in innovative companies building emerging categories, and privacy is no different. At Forgepoint, we invest in companies that, as we say, defend the digital world. This includes privacy, security, areas of compliance, and so on and so forth. In fact, we've been quite active across privacy, data security, and compliance. So we see a new class of companies building myriad privacy-enhancing technologies. This is driven by the need to responsibly steward protected information, as you described. So I think we're still in the early days of enterprise adoption across most categories of data privacy. But what's really promising is we just believe that a lot of the adoption is still yet ahead.
Interesting. So, given that you're sort of actively investing in this space, and it sounds like you're also investing in spaces that might involve large-scale machine learning, large-scale amounts of data collection and analysis, right? Why is it important to get that balance between privacy on one side and access to data and use of data on the other side? Is that important? And if it is important, why does it matter so much in this sort of era that we're now in, where big data is driving a lot of the decision making, whether in cybersecurity or otherwise?
Well, look, concerns continue to exist about privacy and the use of personal data in algorithms to serve content or personalized recommendations. As regulatory measures are employed to prevent unauthorized use of personal data, we see businesses looking for ways to protect PII, so while still using or even training on that data. So there are different methods we see in use that can be deployed to accomplish this. For example, just within privacy-enhancing technologies, we see policy management tools. We see secure compute companies. We talk to many federated learning tools for AI, ML. And then there's a whole crop of analytics and collaboration platforms that do anything from anonymization to creating synthetic data, homomorphic encryption. Differential privacy or secure multi-party compute are just several categories within that. So there are several benefits to this, and these include you can unlock data for AI that was previously difficult to access. You can uncover value from data without crossing the boundaries of ethical or regulatory restrictions on the use of data. And you can also prevent personal data from being used in the training of algorithms. And that's really important. So with AI acceleration, we believe that collection, processing, and use of data in a privacy-preserving manner can also unlock new business opportunities.
Interesting. So Damien, as we think about this sort of opportunity space that Andrew's talking about, right? This new era of big data being used, but being used in a way that can protect individual privacy and maybe open access to a broader set of data that might be exploitable or usable in this domain. Can you talk to us about, sort of in the weeds on differential privacy, how is it really effective? You described it as being the one way we can achieve this sort of balance, right? How effective is it? How does it differ from the traditional ways we do data privacy, this anonymization that you talked about earlier? And do you think it's going to help solve or help address this challenge that Andrew's raised and create these new business opportunities that Andrew's laid out?
Yeah. One thing that's important to understand at a sort of fundamental level is that anytime you do anything with data, when it comes to data sharing or data publication, there's always a trade-off between privacy, the level of like how much information about individuals you're actually leaking inadvertently or not, and how much utility, how much accuracy you get out of the data. How valuable is it? This trade-off exists whether you use differential privacy or not. This is sort of a fundamental fact of life that you can't have infinite value, like you can't extract infinite value of data, release arbitrarily many statistics with good accuracy without also having catastrophic privacy failures. Differential privacy is the one notion that gives you the tools to reason about these trade-offs in a principled manner, in a way that you can actually quantify and put a number on each side. So usually it's very easy for people to put a number on the accuracy, on the value thing. Right? If you're creating new data for, if you're creating a data product from sensitive data to do monetization, the business person is going to be able to tell you, here's how much I think people can pay for this data. If you're a hospital sharing data with researchers, the value is, do the researchers succeed in getting accurate research results by analyzing the data that we gave to them. The hard bit is often on the other side, which is how do you actually define privacy? And this is where differential privacy is the one sort of thing, the one notion that gives you a number that actually makes sense from a formal standpoint, from a mathematical standpoint. A lot of past notions like anonymity, they give you this sort of like parameter, but this parameter does not correspond to an actual risk quantification. Differential privacy gives you a number that actually is directly linked to the risk that the data release incurs for individuals, which is sort of, I think, a distinguishing factor.
So can I dive in a little bit on that? So I understand. So I get what you're saying, that differential privacy allows you to decide on that trade-off. But doesn't that trade-off seem challenging in and of itself, in the sense that, look, if I want to protect privacy, I have to give up accuracy. I mean, presumably, like shifting a manual shift car, there's some friction point where the trade-off's the right one, right? And maybe it's that differential privacy tells you where that friction point is. But are we worried that we're going to lose too much accuracy in trying to protect privacy? I mean, can we really effectively? I guess what I'm asking is, can we really effectively do both?
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is, the trade-off is going to be there as sort of, you can see it as like a physical law almost, like it's a fact of life that we can't really like do anything against. There's like mathematical theorems that sort of tell you that you can't do a great job at both, or at least you can't have perfect score at both. So it's all about sort of deciding where you stand on the line, deciding where you go on the trade-offs. And there's some use cases for which it makes sense to sort of release data that's a little risky because it's enabling a use case that may be socially beneficial or like makes a lot of sense for one reason or another. And then there are other use cases where privacy is much more paramount, and therefore the data owner is going to feel much more comfortable with the idea of, okay, paying an accuracy price because the alternative is not releasing the data at all. Right? There's a lot of sort of use cases. For example, we worked with the Wikimedia Foundation to publish statistics about browsing patterns on Wikipedia. They're really sensitive about the data. This is very, knowing who visited certain Wikipedia pages could get somebody in big troubles in some authoritarian countries. And therefore, this is data that would just not be accessible to researchers had we not helped them do this in a sort of principled way.
Interesting. So, Andrew, as you think about this sort of space, right, and some of the use cases that Damien just talked about, right, and you're looking at startups in security, deep tech, AI, in your mind, what are the emerging applications and innovations that will have the greatest potential for disruptive growth and long-term growth in that domain, right? I mean, given that we're going to have to make this trade-off, as Damien describes it, it's a trade-off you have to make, accuracy versus privacy, right? Do we think that it's going to drive long-term innovation? If so, what spaces do you see that happening in?
Well, let's take a step back. So when we talk to chief security officers, chief privacy officers, or trust officers, we see organizations in various stages of adoption of emerging privacy technologies. So at a most basic level, all organizations need to establish a baseline privacy program. And they do this with tools for data discovery, classification, risk mapping, data retention, and so on. Privacy comes in through things like consent and preference management, cookie management, and subject rights management. But that's at a most basic level. After getting the basics right, maturing organizations can then focus on the ongoing administration, resource management, scalability of these recurring tasks that their privacy teams might already face. And they do this through tools that automate things like privacy impact assessments, automated reporting, building into their privacy centers self-service portals for users to view how their data is maintained. And then lastly, what we see mature organizations doing is they're then able to focus on things like differential privacy, data masking and tokenization, or even privacy enhancing computation. As for differential privacy, there are many techniques to address problems in preserving privacy when training AI models, and differential privacy ensures the privacy of individual rows of data while supporting meaningful analysis of aggregated data. So that's useful in many areas, and we see applications for this across financial services, healthcare, and retail. In cybersecurity, we also see applications for information sharing, incident response, cyber insurance, just to name a few.
I want to dive into this latter space you talked about, cyber insurance and cybersecurity, and maybe even the national security piece of this. So, we know that we need tremendous amounts of data to get cybersecurity right in order to identify potential new and emerging threats. We know that to do insurance right, we need to understand the behavior patterns of individuals, the behavior patterns of attacks, what people are vulnerable to, and how to sort of figure that out to price insurance risk. But that relies on a lot of granularity, right, about what users are doing, who's doing what, how they're doing it. And it sounds like differential privacy might allow us to derive the insights we need, but also protect user privacy. Is that the right way to think about it? And if it is, the next question I want to come to, and I want to talk about national security, but just in this space alone, is that the right way to think about the sort of benefits of differential privacy for mature organizations like you described in the cybersecurity and insurance domains?
Well, look, that's absolutely right, Jamil. There's a lot of different use cases when you think about what's the value in different aggregated data sets. Insurance, you see this across government, not just Census Bureau, but tax authorities often do this. Those that might release information, you think about national healthcare programs. Many of our friendly countries across Europe. This is very important. Getting health outcomes is also right. So there's a lot of different use cases that we can see here, and the question is, how big of a problem can we really solve, and then how useful is the data then that you're either supplying to researchers, to teams, or even for internal analysis, and that's what we really want to be focusing on.
So can I just follow up on that a little bit? So if you're using this to price insurance risk, right, which you all are investors in cyber insurance company, right? Do we worry that this trade-off that Damien and I were talking about between privacy on one side, accuracy on the other, right? Like, are we going to run into a problem if we're protecting individual privacy, lowering our accuracy at some level? Is that going to cause pricing problems in the insurance market? And if so, how do we solve for that one? Because at least as a general matter, when I think about my insurance company, my home insurance, my car insurance, they know the risky behaviors I engage in, right? Because I disclose that to them, whether it's smoking or whatever things, alcohol consumption, whatever it might be, right? Or driving fast. They, presumably they give me a discount if I let them track how fast I'm driving, right? So insurance companies want to know that, and they want to associate with me so they can risk adjust my insurance premium. Is the same thing true in cyber, or can we get a little more anonymity and use this differential privacy to benefit us?
Well, Jamil, I think there's a difference between the idiosyncratic risk and the aggregated risk in insurance. And so when you think about aggregated data sets, insurance is not the only use case here. We do this already for airline safety data, right? And so why can't we then do it for just measuring systemic risk across areas like cyber? And that's like you mentioned, Jamil, that's an area where we've spent a lot of time in, and we've applied this kind of analysis already to episodes like what we call crowd out. The outage of CrowdStrike just a few weeks ago. We've seen this in other aggregation events, whether it's hyperscalers going down or applying to DDoS attacks or even to nation-state attacks. So this is already happening, and it's because there's value in aggregated data sets that de-anonymize the individual data rows that stand behind that. Whether it's privacy-enhancing technologies like this, what I'd say are the true insights is, what does the systemic risk look like for these major aggregation, the 1 in 10, 1 in 20, 1 in 100 type events that we're already seeing across cyber.
Yeah. So, Damien, Andrew talks about sort of these rare events, these anomalous events that could take place in the data, and there's a difference between that idiosyncratic data, as he refers to it, right, and sort of the larger risk models you might build. So, differential privacy feels like it can help us on that large aggregated data, but when we're talking about data sets, maybe national security data sets where rare anomalous behavior is the thing you're looking for, the thing you want to identify, might it have less relevance or might it be less effective because their accuracy might matter a lot? And if so, how do we tackle the privacy problem when it comes to sensitive data sets like national security data?
Yeah, this is a really intriguing question in a way, because what you want out of a use case like anomaly detection, where you're trying to sort of detect individual anomalous data points, behaviors that do not correspond to the whole, this is sort of like philosophically and also concretely at odds with the idea of protecting individual privacy. There are notions of there's variants of differential privacy that can, for example, can protect most people in the data set except the outliers. So what you can do is you can build a model to understand what is the typical behavior, and that is the behavior that corresponds to like most people. Therefore, you don't need you can totally use privacy enhancing technology with provable guarantees like differential privacy to do that, and then based on that model, figuring okay, what does not correspond to the model. So in a way, you have to sort of separate the two stages. First, the model the part where you understand what is typical behavior, that you can do in a sort of anonymized way, in a way that provides for more provable guarantees. And then the actual detection part is the part that you're going to be like, okay, the goal of this is to detect specific individual events. And in that case, you can't claim that the process of doing that is an anonymizing process, because this is about figuring out who did unusual things.
Yeah. So let me ask you about that, Damien, because you did mention it's sort of a philosophical question, right? And obviously in the terrorism context, it's obvious we want to know who the terrorist is. We want to identify that anomalous behavior and catch him. But you can also imagine a world in which the anomalous behavior, the outlier, is a disfavored group or a disfavored person or a disfavored set of entities that are the minority in a given population, whether it's a community, a jurisdiction, a country, right? And if that's the case, it sounds like these things might be at odds, because where we want to identify anomalous behavior, cybersecurity, terrorism, we want to de-anonymize. We're going to have to use an anonymous process. But you can imagine that same capability being exploited by those who want to identify outliers in their population and take action against those outliers, whether they're, free thinkers or disfavored groups in that context.
Yeah, are you saying that anti-terrorism technology tends to inherently disfavor marginalized and rare demographic groups?
Not at all. To the contrary, I actually don't think that's true, right? There's a debate, to be fair, Damien, right? There's a debate about this, and Andrew and I will get into this in a second. But putting aside that question, I guess what I'm saying is it must be true, right, that the same capability that identifies, bad guys, right, quote unquote, right, and I don't mean anything gendered by that, right, but bad people, right, or cyber attacks that are variations from the significant variations of the norm, might also identify those people that are in minority groups that are variations from the norm of a given background rule in society, whether it's it's a particular social group that you have concerns about, or a particular ethnic group. If they're not the majority population, they might be easier to identify in a technique that doesn't use anonymization. Is that roughly right? Is that one of the concerns?
That's right, and it also sort of highlights a problem with sort of anonymization, or like a potential issue that we have to think about and mitigate whenever we do anonymization technology. So whenever we do, for example, differential priority release, usually the data set that we start with has a lot of different varying subpopulations, and the same sort of mathematical laws that I mentioned earlier that says you can't have perfect accuracy and perfect privacy. There's always going to be a trade-off. The least amount of people in each subgroup, the steeper that trade-off is, which makes sense. It's easier to re-identify people in a very small subgroup, demographic minority, than it is to de-anonymize someone that sort of more fits within the crowd.
Yeah. So Andrew,
so this means that you have to sort of like measure what you're doing in various parts of your data set to make sure that you're not, that the end application you have is not going to incur sort of unfair bias to specific populations. You have to detect this in advance, and the community has developed a host of techniques to try and mitigate that, or at least sort of being aware of this so that the downstream use cases can take this into account and course correct to prevent sort of socially undesirable outcomes.
Yeah. So Andrew, what about that, right? I mean, there is this trade-off, right, between privacy and security that we've been talking about, or privacy and accurate data. That's not even security; it's really just accuracy that Damien's been talking a lot about. But in these high-profile data sets the government has, right, data that we're trying to collect and identify potential terrorists, potential cyber attacks, and the like, and you might worry about it less in the cyber domain because it's bits, zeros, and ones. Ultimately, it might point to a given actor, but it's really a threat that you're looking for. But in the counterterrorism context, we're talking about individuals we're trying to de-anonymize, we're trying to identify and stop a larger scale attack, right? And I think as a general matter, as a national security hawk myself, right, I think, okay, that trade-off is worth it, right? But how do we think about that in the context of applying differential privacy to government data sets and the like, right? There's been a lot of talk about this historically when during the terrorist surveillance program with the NSA's data set. You've worked on surveillance programs. At the end of the day, my view is, look, we should use privacy enhancing technologies as much as possible. But at the end of the day, if the goal is to identify terrorists that might cause large harm to society, that's a trade we've got to engage in. How do you think about that in the investment domain, if at all, particularly as you're looking at national security technologies that might be utilized to defend the nation or defend our allies and democratic societies?
Well, Jamil, let me address that in two parts. First, as an investor focusing on the commercial use cases, and then also as somebody who's come out of the national security community. So just like any technology, what we look for as investors is it must solve a pressing business need. And no business will survive without customers. So if you're telling me that privacy matters, show me the market demand. As an investor, I want to see that you have users who are willing to pay for your solutions. So that's table stakes. Now, getting back to national security, though, first of all, there are very different collection requirements or limitations placed on data when used by governments for things like intelligence matters or law enforcement, healthcare, taxing, regulatory, and compliance. than, say, for commercial purposes. And these restrictions matter. So for law enforcement, there are very different requirements for evidentiary standards, what is and what is not admissible. Now, for healthcare, things like vaccine passports may fly in some places, but generally not in the U.S. The conversation might be different on service delivery between public or private providers. And now for intelligence matters, data collection can be both more restrictive and permissive. So despite what Max Schrems seems to think in Europe, U.S. intelligence agencies are really unlikely to care about him. But the moment he begins cavorting with known terrorists, he or any individual as a non-U.S. citizen abroad has no presumption of protection from a U.S. intelligence agency. That is just the way the world works. So norms around data standards also vary by government models. So expectations of privacy within our republic, as in any other like-minded Western democracy, are quite different than you also might find in places like China or Russia. Now, for cyber defense, that's another topic altogether. So there's an assumption that more data is better. Better data, better ML, training sets, better correlation, but that might not always be the case. And we've seen instances where synthetic data can enable better model outcomes. The data itself isn't real, but deterministic and useful to training at scale. So look also at cross-company or industry collaboration. That's a very difficult nut to crack, and it's why we're seeing in the commercial sector renewed interest in things like privacy-enhancing technologies to capture new insights in privacy-preserving ways.
Interesting. First time I've heard somebody say less data might be better, but you're not saying less data might be better. You're saying synthetic data, more accurate data, because it's modeled on other outcomes, might be better than data that's sort of, real world data, but less accurate net. So that's interesting. Damien, I want to give you a chance because Andrew did take a pot shot at Max Schrems, and I tend to agree with him. So I want to give you a chance because I know you're on the you're an advisor to the Data Protection Board. Talk to us about this sort of, there is this, I think, dichotomy between where Europe is on privacy and where the U.S. is on privacy, particularly when it comes to internal use, because the U.S. government has all these, very clear restrictions around how we collect and use data. And, I think the European population generally has concerns about that, but at the same time, European governments have a lot less protections on collection on their own people, and yet that seems to go unnoticed. Talk to us a little about the dynamic there in Europe, and how this plays out, if you would.
So, as a sort of general disclaimer, I am no legal expert. I have no no inside knowledge of sort of like the sort of legal processes involving Schrems or others. Well, one thing that's sort of fairly different, I believe, in Europe is the approach to privacy, legislatively and also culturally, is more rights-based as opposed to harms-based. So in the US, if you want to sort of sue somebody for having misused your data, you have to show how you were harmed by them using your data in a certain way. If they've done, if they've been very careless with your data, but you're not personally harmed, you basically don't have, is my understanding, very rough understanding from a distance, you basically don't have grounds to go to trial about this. In Europe, the situation is quite different, because the idea is that it's more rights-based in the sense of like privacy is seen as a right to the same degree of like you have a right to move around Europe free, you have a right to not having your speech censored, and so on and so forth. And so therefore, when companies mishandle your data, don't encrypt it, share it with third parties without a legal basis or appropriate anonymization techniques in place, even if no harm has come directly to you as a result of that, this company might be in trouble with, in particular GDPR.
Interesting.
So the opportunity here for technologies that sort of mitigate these possible situations where companies find themselves out of compliance is really where privacy-enhancing technologies can help.
It's interesting that your view is that Europe has a stronger rights-based approach, given that sort of in the United States, I think we would think of ourselves as sort of, we have these amendments to the Constitution that protect exactly the rights you described, right? And that I think we'd argue that we have rights-based approach too. But I take your point that at the end of the day, it's a question of which comes first, the right or the harm. And so I think that's an interesting question. I do want to ask you in the limited time that we have remaining, Damien, as you think about these larger questions, right? These questions, the right basis approach on one side, right? The results-based approach on the other, and you think about the larger threats and challenges to privacy and security at the same time in this era where we're collecting larger and larger amounts of data, using larger amounts of data, whether genuine data or synthetic data, right? How bullish are you? And I assume you're pretty bullish since you're in a company that does this, but how bullish are you on the odds of differential privacy being a game changer in this domain?
Yeah, I'm pretty bullish. I feel like differential privacy is where, as an industry, as a technology, is where cryptography was maybe 30 years ago. 30 years ago, there was a bunch of people who were doing cryptography who were trying to say things like, okay, you can't just invent a new scheme, and because you didn't manage to break your own scheme, declare it safe and sell it as like good cryptography technology, right? You actually have to ground your stuff in math, prove that your thing is safe, show us the theorems and the proofs, and otherwise, if you don't do this, your stuff's going to be broken, and you're going to look terrible. Your users are going to be at risk. Your compliance story is going to be at risk, and so on and so forth.
Got it. And Andrew,
people who were saying, people who were like holding these, like who were saying that, were not really, in the majority. People were like, okay, sure, that's fine, that's great academic work, but it's not really, critical. Nowadays, of course, if you don't do that and you pretend to be cryptography, you're just being left out of the room.
Yeah, so it's no longer just an ivory tower thing.
In the anonymization space, yeah.
Sorry, say that again. I talked over you.
I think differential privacy is exactly that in the anonymization safe, in the privacy preserving sort of data sharing set of technologies. I think today a lot of people just sort of still continue to think that you can remove identifiers, aggregate your data somewhat, and then be safe. Today, this is sort of a normal thing to do in industry, and people don't seem to sort of academics all agree to say that this is bad, but it has not permeated the entire industry and the entire government space just yet. The U.S. Census has moved on to use differential privacy, but a lot of government agencies around the world are not there yet. But I think at the end of the day, the technology that's going to stand the test of time there is the one that's grounded in, actual science in a way.
Interesting. So, Andrew, I think what Damien's laying out is this idea that you've got an ivory tower construct, right? That's now coming down. It's in practice. It's actually working in the real world, and yet it's not got the adoption it needs to have. But at least in theory, it can help us with these trade-offs. So, from an investor perspective, right? You're actually putting money to work and having to put money behind sort of these theories. And so, I'm interested in your view, and you get the last word on this, right? How do you sort of view the scalability and the long-term viability of things like differential privacy, other privacy-enhanced technologies in the companies you invest in? I mean, how do you sort of assess whether these technologies can really adapt and scale in the long term to meet evolving market demands and ultimately deliver the kind of returns that you need in a venture capital-backed environment?
Well, Jamil, on the standalone basis, scalability has been tough. So consider a few things. The solutions that reference the use of differential privacy are not always comparable or equally easily implemented. So that's the first challenge. Another is organizations often lack a framework to constantly or consistently determine the appropriate privacy approach based on use case requirements. And that's what any business is focusing on, is solving business challenges. And then I'd say lastly, there's often a lack of familiarity with things like homomorphic encryption, differential privacy, and those organizations may have a lack of skilled staff to effectively deploy or manage it, which sometimes hinders adoption. So we're in this cycle of the market now where there's this learning and education, and as investors, we want to see really these reference customers coming around and buying and implementing at scale.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. All right, folks, that's a wrap. Thank you to both Dr. Damien Desfontaines from Tumult Labs and Andrew McClure from Forgepoint Capital for joining us today. And thank you to Keel and Wolf, Claude Jennings, the entire NSI CTC staff for their help in producing today's episode. The Control F podcast, including our Game Changing Technology series, is also on YouTube. So if you want to check out Dr. Desfontaines and Andrew McClure's smiling faces as well as mine, you can check out our page on YouTube, NSI's page, for a video of today's episode. And be sure to join us for our next episode in just 2 short weeks, where we're going to explore how zero trust security is upending traditional network protection by enforcing continuous verification and compartmentalization within applications extending across government, private industry, and the personal environment. And as always, if you like what you heard or saw on YouTube, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.